Hello, welcome everyone. This is a sample episode of the forthcoming Engaging Occupational Science podcast. Plans are to have this podcast launch fully in the new year, and this is going to be launching concurrently with the Foundations of Occupational Science course. So I wanted to include the first example episode of content that will be featured in this podcast and also that you can start engaging with starting out later this month with an example episode of an interview I had with Dr. John White around his sort of occupational narrative and occupational history in relation to exposure to occupational science. Most of us, especially occupational therapy clinicians here in the United States, often have gotten distant or delayed exposure to occupational science, and I still come across many occupational therapy practitioners and providers that have never heard of occupational science at all. I was somewhat exposed to occupational science for my initial occupational therapy degree, but it wasn't until I got to take a course on occupational science in my post-professional online doctorate with the University of Utah that I really got to consider it in the context of my current practice as an occupational therapist. And it totally revitalized my sense of optimism and hope for the field. And I found that it was a missing ingredient to my practice and even just my worldview in understanding my own life and the life of my clients and the context that I inhabit as an occupational being. And so I made it the focus of my capstone to look at making this science more accessible to various stakeholders. I'm going to start by creating an accessible online course and learning community for occupational therapy practitioners based in the United States, so we can start making ground on some of the disparities, the educational disparities that have limited access to exposure to occupational science. I want to start bringing this really unique and inspiring perspective to more people and to hopefully model how we can start engaging with it. And also feature some of the engaging speakers and body of work that have been developing over the past 30 years. I feel that this example with John is such a great sample of how occupational science and adopting an occupational science lens can truly be transformative and emboldening and create new avenues of envisioning where fields like occupational therapy can go, or how we can start looking on the challenges that we're facing as a society together with a really constructive lens that looks at enhancing agency and possibility rather than limiting and restricting it. So I really hope you enjoy this episode as an example of the forthcoming podcast and an opportunity to join in on the course. If you want to be one of the first 40 members of the cohort, please check out the link below this episode and get signed up for the initial onboarding release of the course. I'm so excited to share and build this community together with you guys going into the new year. Welcome everyone. This is another discussion and interview that I am really excited to share with you as clinicians that may be getting exposed to occupational science for maybe the first time. I got an opportunity, I think it was about 2 years ago from now, that I joined the Society for the Study of Occupation in the United States of America, or SSO USA, which we've referred to in a previous conversation in a prior module, but that's one of the United States association that's really dedicated to supporting the development of occupational science in the United States with scholars. And actually what I've learned over the years that I've gotten to be in touch with them is that they're actually now making a really explicit commitment to partnering with field clinicians and blending that world of more scholarship with also appreciating what occupational science means in practice. So it's exciting. I got to be on the ground floor of some of those conversations by just passively joining in their virtual conference while I was a student at University of Utah. I'd just taken the course in occupational science that we've talked about, and I felt really welcome to join the virtual conversation. It was so exciting, the conversations that they were having, and I was seeing how it was related to what I was doing in practice. And Dr. John White, who you're going to meet today, put out an open invitation during the business meeting saying that they were looking for a techie millennial to help with their journal community because they were working together as a team to develop soon we're going to get our own journal for occupational science in the United States through the SSO. And he created an opening. He expanded the field for somebody that I haven't gotten a PhD before, and I've only taken one class in occupational science, but I responded to the call for a techie millennial, and I got to join a committee and be part of the conversations that developed into this journal. So anyway, that's how I got connected with Dr. John White. And what I'm excited to share with you guys that are getting to know occupational science for the first time, if you have heard about occupational science before, there's a strong likelihood that maybe it got said to you, oh, that's a PhD program. You got to go to a separate school in order to talk about that. Or, oh, occupational science, that's something that started at the University of Southern California. It's a hoity-toity Ivy Tower sort of thing. Doesn't really have much relevance to practice. Those are some common things that I've interacted with before getting my feet in the water in the occupational science world. And I think that getting to interact with John was key for me in realizing that isn't necessarily the most accurate framing of occupational science, and that in fact, a majority of occupational scientists, especially in the United States, actually started as clinicians, just like us. And so what I want to do is, I'll stop talking pretty soon so John can introduce himself, but what I love to explore in this discussion with John is looking at how like he positions himself as a clinician and later occupational science in relation to occupational therapy history and occupational science history, but also explore this amazing opportunity that we've gotten by not having the opportunity to develop a science pace at the beginning of our founding, which luckily we've explored in our history module or earlier in this lecture that you've explored here, is we actually have this great opportunity that we've gotten to develop our science base from clinicians that in many cases have had decades of field experience. And I will hopefully get to explore with John his occupational history and becoming an occupational therapist a bit, that you might be surprised just how much we have in common with him, even if you're a millennial, even if you're a zennial. Some of the challenges that John was navigating on the front lines of his practice in the late 70s and early 80s, and that drove him and motivated him to become a therapist, you might be able to connect to today in some of your occupational history. So I want to really bring together that we actually have a lot more in common than we think. And there's probably a lot that you could really relate to and that you can build partnerships with the occupational sciences scientists that are here in the United States and those that are around the globe. So John, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit too, and maybe just contextualize a little bit, maybe some of your recent background, and we'll go into maybe a little bit talking about your origin story with occupational therapy.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here, Josie, and appreciate that overview of why we're here and how I'm speaking with you today. I fell into occupational therapy. My dad was a doctor. I loved all things health care related, and was focused on a career in medicine when I realized that I had not had much of a sterling academic career in college and probably wasn't going to get into med school, and worked for a year with a good friend of mine who was a jeweler and kind of discovered art and craft. And then I literally decided I love the craft part of this work, but selling things to people to feed me is the hard part, and I'm probably not going to be successful, and I should probably look back at health. And so I looked at several fields and found that PT was probably best suited for who I was at that time and where I wanted to go with my career. Applied, did not get into a fairly competitive program back in South Carolina at the medical university. And because there was a brand new OT program that it got accredited a year early, didn't have time to recruit students. They were pretty desperate to get a class. And they actually asked the PT and nursing and social work programs, have you got people that you think might be a good fit for OT? And so I found out about it secondhand, that I had applied to OT school. And so I was set up with an interview with a phenomenal OT who worked in a clinic that did almost everything that an OT department could do in a medical setting. Pediatrics, mental health, geriatrics, the range of physical rehabilitation, hand therapy, and it integrated crafts in a way that you never see or very rarely see anymore in occupational therapy setting. And I was like, oh, wow, this is a nice fit for what I was interested in. I'll follow this up. And if I get in, I think I'll try it out. And the more I got in and the more I learned about occupational therapy, the more I realized it was really a better fit for me than physical therapy. I met a woman who was in physical therapy school who later agreed to marry me. And Bonnie and I have compared notes a lot about our professions over the years and have worked literally in the same clinic a number of times and have had a great life and shared careers together. But as I got into practice, my education was very medical model. And I didn't know to really call it that until years later, but that's what it was. And I loved it because that was fulfilling that part of me that had sought that out.
You mind if I set some of the context too of this discussion, where part of what we're exploring is how we situate ourselves as occupational therapists, and in your case as an occupational scientist. And I'm hoping that all of you out there are starting to see yourself as emerging occupational scientists in this practical way. So it's helpful for all of us to think about how are we situated in this historical context, and what are some of these threads where did they come from? Where did they start? And how do we relate to them today? I know from previously talking to John that while he was going through his initial stages of OT education and starting to enter the field, just to set some of that historic context, am I right that it was in the late 70s that you were going to?
Yeah, I started school in 76.
Okay, so that was probably getting pretty far into, it was in the first decade or two of the development of Medicare. And it was right as we were starting to really consider deinstitutionalizing a lot of the mental health sector. Is that kind of right to your approximation being there?
It was beginning about that.
To be maybe a conversation in the discourse of shining a light on a lot of harms that institutional mental health settings were having, where this is triggering language, but people felt that they were just like human storage units or something. Like we weren't really engaging folks in the mental health. So we're starting to create maybe legislative conversations about what it looked like to deinstitutionalize the mental health sector. And I think at that time, that's where probably a majority of OTs in the US maybe had employment. Is that true to your perspective?
It was still a large percentage.
Maybe 25%, something like that, like a quarter of OTs.
At least, yeah, I would say about a quarter. And those were in typically the large mental health institutions, but also the smaller hospital-based clinics. I did an internship in a fairly large regional hospital's mental health rehabilitation center. And they had everything from, again, lock unit to outpatient services. And it was very robust. And there were probably 5 occupational therapists employed in that facility. And I did another one in a community mental health center that was all outpatient based. And I would say that they averaged 75 to 100 clients and had, again, a fairly robust occupational therapy staff of probably 3 occupational therapists and 5 OT assistants.
So you got to have, in some cases, one of maybe like the last vantage points as an OT student, and to some extent in the field, where you got to see that baton getting passed of some of the more, probably some of the practices that were happening with OT in the mental health settings that were getting divested from, probably had some of those more craft-based, more occupation-based monikers of the founding school of thought. And then in lifetime, as you were going through education, you were probably seeing that shift towards more of the Medicare based and more of a medicalized model. And what I'm hearing from even your occupational narrative too is you came from a cultural context that really highly valued. That was something that really showed esteem, and probably some of the things that we're exploring here too is just how much our connection to our ancestors and the occupations of our family system can have a drive on how we occupationally adapt in our own lives. I imagine that's something that a lot of us can connect to today, because I know I went to my master's degree right in 2015, where I noticed that we would talk a lot about a lot of the corporations that were coming in and taking over the therapy contracts for skilled nursing facilities that were owned usually by it used to be community-based oriented, quote unquote, mom and pop based nursing facilities. And I got to see some of that initial wave in Eastern Washington of more of the therapy contracting companies coming through. And I know probably everyone on here, if you're from Gen X, you probably saw the first stages of the PPS system getting recalibrated. And now we're living through PDPM and a transition to value-based care. Even though it was in the late 70s, it sounds like you've had your fair share of probably being a nervous OT student of, where am I going to go? How is the system going to work? How are we going to relate to this? Yeah.
I wish I'd had the foresight to kind of anticipate some of that. Mostly I've analyzed it in retrospect, but a big part of what was happening at that point was there were a number of factors. The deinstitutionalization was a really important movement that got waylaid by a lack of funding. And I won't go into the politics of it, though I'm tempted. But basically, the governments realized if we deinstitutionalize these people, we'll save a lot of money by not running these 24/7, 365 care centers. And a lot of these people will be all right in outpatient, and they can do some independent living, and we'll have some community support. Very little of the community support was realized. And I believe, and there's a good bit of research evidence to support, that our criminal justice challenges and our houseless and homeless based populations are at least an indirect and sometimes direct result.
Victims of that divestment area. And that is something that I would, from knowing you, and hopefully we'll get to spell this out for those that are watching this here. In the other interview that we're including in this module, we have some discussion about what's called performative activism, or giving lip service to a program and not necessarily showing up with that tangible effort. One of the things that is a value that I have that's consistent with occupational therapy and occupational science is that pragmatic idealism, right? We have ideals and aspirations and things that we want to aspire to as part of human values for human betterment. And one of the wonderful things about occupational therapy is we've always wanted to show up in an active way and have some sort of a tangible result as the product of maybe our interventions. We can't perfectly clarify them, but we're going to get somehow to a functional outcome and some sort of meaningful demonstration of act. And what I'm hearing from you, John, is you maybe got to see some of that tragedy of maybe a lot of lip service paid to the notion of deinstitutionalization, but it really was almost just a transfer of funds to the incarceration system, or really, into policing. And that's something I wonder, I imagine this maybe would take some post-reflection on your part too, and maybe you've done some of it, is it's interesting where you're positioned in the historic context as an OT student, starting to, even if you're not aware of it, getting to observe some of this actually taking place, where you were in a position where you could see what OT was like before and what the infrastructure looked like before, and you could almost bear witness to what was lost.
Yeah.
And
another powerful factor that happened simultaneously was the development of, or the evolution of psychotropic medications. And suddenly the service, one of the services that had been valued by occupational therapy, which was keeping clients occupied and better managed and hopefully living a somewhat higher quality of life, in their institutions was not as important because the psychotropic medications.
You could replace it with just this medication without having to pay the salary or the benefits package of frontline staffing that could mediate the same result with maybe a higher quality of life.
That's right.
Which in some ways mirrors too, because what I'm learning about now in my own studies is looking at the moral treatment movement, which I think even predates some of the arts and crafts movement.
Yes.
So we know that OT
absolutely
connects to arts and crafts movement, but if you look even before that, there was a moral treatment movement.
At least by 100 years.
So the moral treatment movement was of a similar vein to that of it's maybe much more humane that we engage and we have these benefits of engaging people in meaningful activity. And that also got shut down in a similar way to what you're saying. Once there was a replacement of that and it became more mediated by the emerging Western medical system and the United States medical system, they actually just squashed that down and kicked it out.
As Adolf Meyer pointed out in his really foresightful analysis of what occupational therapy could be and the role that occupation would play in it, there was more room in the state-supported hospital systems, asylum systems, to experiment with occupation and learn how it could really help and serve that population than there was in the private hospitals. The private hospitals were concerned that families would see their family members being abused by asking them to do activities around the grounds or in the workshops or in the facilities. And so it was much more restricted. And there were arts and crafts opportunities in those, perhaps even richer ones or more supported ones in the private facilities. But again, that was that tug between state funding, private funding, pre-insurance days, really. But how are we going to take care of these people in need? So yes, it was a big dilemma. And over the next certainly 20 years, and I think it even took less time than that, from the mid-70s, the mental health psychosocial component of occupational therapy dropped from that, let's say, 25% workforce down to about 3%, and even less, even smaller.
Similar to the percentages that we have that explicitly identify themselves as quote unquote mental health OTs.
Yep.
I'm personally an advocate, especially the more I learn about occupational therapy history and occupational science and our founders, where I think you mentioned Adolf Meyer, and Adolf Meyer, I think he ended up going in the direction of psychology and psychiatry, but he was an early adopter.
Yeah. He was a very prominent psychiatrist.
We have two very prominent psychiatrists that were big champions of occupation-based practice. If I'm accurate, I think Adolf Meyer is somebody to credit for some of speaking into words, the biopsychosocial, what we say frame of reference, right, in occupational therapy terminology. But he was an early champion of saying, you know what, I don't know if we can disconnect these systems. I don't know if we really can really separate all these things and have them be cohesive. So me personally, learning about our history and our science, I personally champion that all OTs are mental health OTs, because it's really difficult to be occupation-based without taking into account that part of somebody's occupational profile. And I think it's actually a disservice to our patients if we don't acknowledge that as part of our practice in every setting personally. And I'm going to be a big advocate for that. But at the same time, we did used to have a strong tradition of OTs developing our practices, developing our livelihood in more of a mental health sector that got divested because of changing policy interests. And I would say, to be so bold, as somewhat performative activism in the late 70s and 80s, where we divested from the infrastructure we did have and didn't really follow up with the good.
Yeah, we didn't follow up and we didn't advocate. And that also intersected with the time in which I was fairly apolitical. I really didn't want to be involved in politics. I didn't see it as a useful way to occupy my time. And it took at least 5, if not 10 years for me to begin to realize that life is political. And if you don't get involved, you're making a comment in a negative way. You're letting things happen without having an influence. And it took another 10 years to apply that, at least another 10 years for me to get involved more professionally in, one might say, the political structures, the national and state organizations, and advocating. And what I realized in retrospect was that our national association dropped the ball. It allowed these changes to happen. And again, I think for economic reasons more than anything else, and lack of political influence. We know
somewhat of a disorienting dilemma in a way that I think something that I regret that I didn't get to highlight more in the module that the lesson that talks about disorienting dilemmas is realizing how much your livelihood is really connected to your survival as an occupational being. And especially if you're living with, if you have families, if even, I think this is especially true too of any occupational therapists that come from more minoritized backgrounds. It's not a small thing getting through these systems to the point that you can access a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. We can look back at some of the choices that our OT ancestors and legacies made, but I imagine we can probably identify with them that if you're at a place where, being more of that activist and coming out, it's terrifying. It's terrifying to potentially risk your livelihood by challenging some of these shifting policy structures, because the more you explore the history of the physical health system in the United States, and John, I think we'll get a chance too to explore how your life path is also now involved taking a look at where that money did go, like how does incarceration, how does that relate to occupational well-being and how that evolved? Those systems, they can be somewhat violent in the United States, and they can be not very understanding, and they can make it very clear that activism and change are not welcome conversations. Right. I think we all can connect to understanding where some of those trade-offs went. And I think too, one of the things I want to challenge our students to consider that AOTA, like it or not, it's a reflection of those of us that are in the field. It is a volunteer organization. It is a member-led organization, and it can be an easy thing to scapegoat and target out and have it be. Wouldn't it be nice if all the problems are AOTA and not something that's also a reflection of our values and so I just want to say this is a challenging thing for all of us to navigate, and it can be easy to be in a state of judgment about things in the past, and I've been angry about it. I totally get it. But if you really think about it, we're still facing these challenges today, and we often do make some of those compromises in order to financially sustain the life that we're looking for. And these are not easy questions, and that's why we have to navigate this together with some mindfulness about what it means to actually shift these systems today. What opportunities do we have today to maybe get involved? And I would be curious, John, too. I'm wondering, how did that evolution take place? Because you're saying you got to a place where at your initial stages in your career, you were like blind to some of the political context that was going on. Maybe you were passively observing it, but it wasn't something that was as relevant. And I know you said at the time when you previously discussed this with me that you were really developing your career in a very promising way. You were very diligent at the medical model. You really created some of those do you want to talk a little bit about some of those bright spots in your initial career and how you contextualize them now?
Yeah, I was focused on life balance and developing my practice chops. And I'd had some wonderful fieldwork experiences in both psychosocial and physical disability realms, and decided that I really needed to develop the skills within the physical realm, and got to work in some very innovative physical rehabilitation settings, and I think was recognized for my ability to integrate new knowledge. I was an early NDT certificate for adult hemiplegia treatment, and that kind of set me on a path of working in neurological realm. Did a lot of work with spinal cord injury and head injury.
Standardized protocols was something that it sounded like you were pretty interested in, was how do we really make OT esteemed and reputable by implementing almost, I would classify them not in a way to disparage it, as like more sterile and more clinical and more linear. Is that accurate?
Yes, because that was recognized both within the field and by my colleagues in PT and medicine and nursing and social work and speech therapy as the way to be in practice. This is the way we
how to
our practice.
Secure our future. Just like it's a question today of the more standardized we can make our approach, it has the sense of we'll have safety with that.
Yeah. And because I had an intuitive appreciation for what occupation was at the time, though I didn't call it that, I called it activity because that was the predominant word that we applied to it. I used it in practice and I looked for opportunities for a person's interests to fuel creativity about ways to integrate that interest into their therapy. But I did it surreptitiously. I did not own it. I did not.
Like breaking the rules in a way. I think we talked about that earlier, that sometimes like doing these actual stuff that you remembered probably and got to experience from the more old school occupational therapy at the time and what was taking place, it almost felt like you're breaking the rules, or like a bull in a china shop. You're breaking down the standardized protocols by having the client direct through their values and their interests and their occupations. You were maybe doing it, but it was a little bit off the books.
And it felt, this isn't really being professional. I remember a client who loved to play hacky sack. And because of his head injury, although he was walking, when you saw him walk, you wouldn't say he had much of a disability. His balance was not that solid. And so I modified it to play with a balloon. Yeah. And that gave him time to respond and react. And we slowly worked down to closer and closer activities to playing with hacky sack. And I remember playing with him in the gym one day with the balloon, and a PT walking by. Gosh, it must be nice to be able to play all day. And they said it with, again, that kind of edge of, are you really being a therapist? And so had I been where I got to later with my understanding of what occupation is all about, I would have said, oh yeah, it is.
It is.
To be able to tap the motivation of this person in their balance work more than standing on that balance platform that you're going to put them on later today, and just have them balance on the platform for balance sake.
Sort of a possibly reflective question for you, John, too, in considering some of the context that occupational science has challenged me to consider and to think about how, in building off the arts and crafts movement, where if you take a look at how industrialization has shifted all humans away from, I think we have that idea of occupational alienation, or alienation from our labor, the outcomes of doing more functional activity and meaningful activity as part of our daily life, and how the arts and crafts movement was a resistance to that, saying, we know we need this as part of our identity, as part of our culture, as part of our whole. But as we shifted to more of an industrialized system in the United States, there was, I think, a lot, especially for those that are European and Caucasian descent, like a strong incentive to repress those drives in us. And that seems to be part of being in a more medicalized system, is you got to repress that sense of creativity and play and potential for artistic expression. I've almost had to do my own OT treatment for myself since leaving academia in some ways, because I have really repressed those impulses for play out of fear that you'll get chastised or corrected or something. And I think that's a beautiful thing that occupational science challenges us as all occupational beings to consider. How has our industrialization, colonialization, our culture challenged us to repress these parts of ourselves? And where we've had like pressure, did you feel like there was maybe part of that adapting to a medical model or wanting to uphold a certain image that maybe had like a sense of encouraging you, even just as an occupational being yourself, to repress those more? At the beginning, you said you did have some artistic impulses, but you felt like, I got to put those to the wayside. I got to repress and compromise them to do this thing.
certainly in the professional realm, it was a very strong constraint and restraint on my ability to create and innovate in the way that I thought would have been ideal. And I didn't have the confidence in an alternative point of view.
The language, or maybe even something to connect to that seemed connected to science, because I think something that's still current today in wanting to be a science-based profession is, if you're looking to science to be your guidepost and how it's currently branded and embraced in the United States and in the West, is it is this sterile, clinical, standardized, removing as much of the qualitative domain as possible so that you have just the bare bones structures to look at. So if you're looking at that to guide you as an occupational therapist, it's not going to give you much permission to explore those other things. This might be a good context to think of, because it sounds like you evolved in your career. I wonder if you almost topped out too in some of the professional development realm, because it sounds like you were very successful in building these programs in the hospitals that you're working in. And there was something in you that also wanted more. So it sounded like at a midpoint in your career, you were exploring and looking at, I know you mentioned before that you had an impulse of being interested in teaching these models that you were starting to master in the medical context.
Right. I was getting recognition. I was doing some continuing education work on a small scale in the regional context, and mostly within the facilities within which I worked. And Bonnie and I had a wonderful opportunity to work overseas. We worked in Malaysia for a year and a half. And again, we did some teaching at the national level there, and I got some reinforcement for that, and it fueled my interest in teaching. And having graduated with a bachelor's degree, which was the primary degree that was available in 1978, I realized I needed to get a master's degree, and that got me interested in going back to graduate school. And by this time, I'd been working for 12 years as a practitioner, and I certainly hadn't topped out, but I had developed expertise that was recognized by my peers and supervisors as worthy of sharing and teaching others. And I had, again, a wonderful opportunity to go to graduate school at the University of Southern California. I really hadn't paid a lot of attention to academic reputations and that sort of thing, but the people who I was asking, where should I apply? And most people said, these are the strong schools in the country that you should consider. And so USC was among those. I got a great opportunity to serve as a teaching assistant, again, sharing my rehab skills. And talk about disorienting and transformative experiences. Graduate school blew my mind wide open. I had no idea that I would be exploring anthropology and sociology and neuroscience in the ways that graduate school.
So to bring the historic context in for those that are joining here, so you just by accident in some ways, following that, I want to teach and I'll look into, and you almost stumbled into this back door into a really amazing time and place for occupational therapy history, and certainly the apex of occupational science history in the United States, because you were on the ground floor as an entering master's student. You said a teaching assistant, so like a humble apprentice, and you get to be a fly on the wall and be an active participant into those initial conversations that we're linking out to in this course. There's not time and space to cover all the fodder that there is for occupational science history and occupational therapy history, but you were there with Elizabeth Yerxa, Florence Clark, and then Gayle Frank, and you got to be classmates, I think, with Wendy Wood, which is, I think, one of the scholars we'll get to link out to, and me too.
Jeannie Jackson, Sue Knox. It just was a phenomenal cohort of people, because this was 1989 that I went back for the master's, and that was the year that USC approved the Ph.D. in occupational science to begin. And Doris and Jeannie and Sue and others were in that first cohort of doctoral students. And I was a master's student, and I was able to take a couple of elective courses that coincided with that cohort. And I sat in the room, and my mind again was blown completely, because the level of discussion that I was hearing and the ideas and the knowledge about both occupational therapy and how we were understanding and beginning to explore, and the faculty were developing the concepts around occupational science, was just something that I could never have conceived of. And so my excitement was fueled, and my academic curiosity was fueled, and I began understanding my history in occupational therapy in a very different way. We studied this
in the kind of context, right? In a way that maybe previous. That's one of the things that will have explored so far, is how in many ways, one of the ways that you can describe occupational science is a earnest kind of formal effort of understanding humans in context, in multiple layers, and really taking on the complexity of what it means to relate to context as occupational beings. And there's almost a paradoxical pendulum swing where some of the medical model is trying to understand human beings out of context. We want to take away as much as the environmental factors as possible to see how this functions. Occupational science is almost this total pendulum swing in a different direction of what does it mean if human beings aren't in experimental conditions? What if they're in naturalistic conditions? Yeah. How do they develop? How do they function? And so you got almost like a Wizard Oz seeing behind the mask in a way of how do we contextualize this work?
Yeah, and I think a good example of that, how that evolved with me as it reflected what was happening within both the profession and the science, was I went in interested in developing more practice chops and more theoretical knowledge to support my practice.
You were interested in the more medical model and advancing the system. I think you talked about some initial conversations that I think will sound familiar to a lot of us about robotics and being on the ground floor of the developing of the tech industry in 1989. Like that would have been also like a very fruitful time to go in more of a tech direction at USC. So you had a lot of different options and probably still some prestige in that more traditional medical model. Yeah. I wonder, do you have any sense of having some resistance to occupational science when it first started coming up? Or what do you think it was that sort of got you through that initial stages of disorienting type dilemmas? How did you stay with it?
It was certainly a combination of factors. I did work in the robotics lab with under Ruth Zemke's direction, and did my master's thesis in a super experimental, isolating precision task. How much influence does this position have on a precision action that arose out of watching a dental hygienist work on my teeth and having a conversation with her about carpal tunnel and tendonitis. And yet people persisted doing it. And so it was like, okay, here I am boiling this behavior down to this. And part of what I realized through the other discussions that we were having and Dr. Zemke's tutelage was, this is isolating this out of the context of what we're doing and is giving us some information, but how valid is the information? And simultaneously, I was being fascinated by how anthropology was giving us insights into occupation, how cognitive psychology was giving us insights into occupation, how neuroscience was giving us those, and participating in discussions in these interdisciplinary rooms that were absolutely fascinating, and simultaneously being exposed by Dr. Galia Frank to qualitative and narrative methods of knowing, and realizing that there's a lot about occupational therapy that we can't know through this isolation and decontextualization and scientific control.
Something that we're losing while gaining that more esteemed scientific credibility. And in some ways, we're actually losing that very occupation that we're seeking to elicit in some ways, or could be. We're actually taking the therapy out as we're trying to advance it. And there's a paradox in that. Do you think that in some ways it helps having the prestige and the formal permission in these structures? I think that I think it's a controversial legacy of how occupational science has developed across the world as something that has been fed and fueled by more of these academic-based departments that we're all now increasingly more well aware of how most of our social infrastructure across the world is designed to be more exclusive and to privilege certain perspectives over others. And that's part of why we're building this container here and why we're taking on in AOTA's 2025 vision. How do we work on where there are imbalanced structures? There's a paradox too, in that I think I'm curious your thoughts on this, because in my mind, I'm putting together that there might have been something about having the status of something like USC and having those esteemed founders, the fact that they were in a position of authority in some ways, and that they were able to give you permission to play and to take some of these perspectives out of that. And I guess I'm starting to see that privilege, as much as it is a not good part of our social structures, it's not so good just to deny that, because I think we also have to look at it and see that's where we have agency and where we can develop that. Those of us that are entering this conversation with some privilege, with credentials, with this, we also need to see the value and invitation that's offered and how we can now use that to rebalance these structures. I'm just imagining if I was in your position, knowing that I had the permission of my supervisors to think about things through an anthropological lens or to open up a qualitative box, I think that would help me feel invested in learning about what that perspective had to offer. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Oh, it's huge. And one of the things, again, that sometimes I think I'm a slow learner, because one of the things that I've looked at in context of that phenomenal educational experience is the role of privilege in getting me there. Being a male in occupational therapy brings with it certain benefits. Having grown up white in South Carolina, the son of a physician, very clear and obvious privileges that took me to places that I wouldn't have gotten to. I'm fairly certain, had my circumstances been different and less privileged. And so thinking about how that affected the opportunity that I had at USC and how that has influenced occupational science for all the participants who've been able to go there has definitely been something that I've thought about, particularly in the last few years of social justice work, and how that has, again, given me new insights into this context.
Different schools of thought on this, but one of the things that I have experienced by bearing witness to some of these conversations is that it seems to be really helpful when we adopt a social or occupational justice lens, that there isn't necessarily I almost want to use the word sin, but just the existence of privilege can also be somewhat neutral, in that the goal of many of our social justice movements and our efforts is actually to extend the experience of privilege. So it's not necessarily that if you're born into circumstances where the structures really honor and fuel your strengths, it comes to that point of agency of what do we choose to do with this privilege that we do have. Mm-hmm. All of us, even if you're coming into this course from even a more minotaur status, it probably isn't unfamiliar to you to know that, oh wow, if you are somebody in a more minotarized or marginalized status, being able to go up through these rungs where you do earn credentials or ways that you are honored, that comes with this question of how do we wield this privilege that we have. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I think we're all in a growth and process, but I really think it's an amazing thing that occupational science tradition through its founding, and I think more and more with this invitation that we'll explore in our other interview in this section, we have the opportunity to think about how do we use our privilege, how do we use our agencies to expand who gets access to this pie. And what I'm hoping and what I loved about you acknowledging that there was something helpful about feeling like you had formal permission as a student to engage in these questions, because I feel like I feel connected to your story in a way, John, because it sounds like you humbly stumbled into the ground floor of this amazing moment for the development of occupational science. And I feel like I was just going to that conference 2 years ago. I got to stumble in on the ground floor of the creation of a journal that's going to be here in the United States. And you opened a door for me that wasn't supposed to be in that space. There's some parts of occupational science that can still be a little bit questioning of how inclusive do we make the science. Yeah. And by and large, you still see that majority of the actors and they're engaging in this are wanting to broaden and open up who gets to participate in this effort. And so I just really feel affirmed that as being somebody that carries and acknowledges the privilege, and I aspire to be somebody like that, is also then I have given access to this wonderful gift. How do I increase access to it? How do I, and also be open and humble to learning to see this thing evolve, right? And that we all get to be lifelong learners. And I just feel so privileged that I've gotten to connect with you and get a role model of what it can look like to give these gifts out to the community. And maybe you can speak to too, like how you found yourself on the ground floor of this, and you end up going then from a master's to, they created a space for you too, because part of it, you said, I wasn't that strong of a student. I had to beg, borrow, and steal to get into occupational therapy school from the beginning. So they created an opening for you, and then here they created an opening at USC.
Yeah.
How have you?
Yeah. The circumstances had changed. Again, I'd proven myself in my career. And again, I was fortunate to score well on the GRE, and I had done well in OT school. I had a good academic record, not sterling, but quite respectable from OT school. And it had been 12 years. And so they were looking at me in a very different light, I think. And I had skills that could fulfill a role they needed, the teaching assistant role. So that all fell into place. And if I vary from answering your question, please redirect.
No, that's fine. No, go for it.
But the Ph.D. was brand new. It was untested. It was certainly not proven yet that it was going to work. It looked like it was going to, because we had a really bright group of first students, and the faculty was very enthusiastic and had developed a strong curriculum. They were needing to recruit doctoral students as well to build a cohort. And so I think, I was there at a fortunate time, and I wanted it. I had been so stimulated by the first year in the master, or the 1 year in the master's curriculum, that I really wanted more, and was very excited about what I was.
Exciting, empowering, humbling.
Yeah. And so as I moved into the doctorate, and it gave me the opportunity to move into higher education and teaching occupational therapy students, again, a wide range of experiences there, and learning from colleagues and being attuned to the theoretical world of occupational therapy, which I had never paid much attention to in my practice-focused career.
That it sounds like your OT educators at the time maybe didn't get opportunity to have much exposure to just in and of themselves.
In 1976, we had very little OT theory.
And we didn't have any PhDs. This is part of what I'm hoping to contextualize too, the fact that from the founding of,
when I applied for my master's program, there were 3 PhDs in occupational therapy in the country.
And that's part of the structural barriers that in the beginning of the development of academia in the United States, and development of the Western medical system in the United States, and the development of the mental health system in the United States, women were systematically marginalized from participating in
Absolutely.
education, which
Absolutely.
I think this is a good opportunity too in having that conversation about systemic privilege and how we relate to it as occupational therapists and occupational therapy, and occupational scientists is like we've drawn in that correlation. And I know that you felt somewhat a historical kinship to Adolf Meyer and some of his arc. And remind me, is it William Dutton?
William Dunton, yes.
I got the name right. Okay, very good. Adolf Meyer and William Dunton are considered two of the founding fathers of occupational therapy. And it can be a mixed legacy, the fact that they were privileged at that time in the development of the academic infrastructures and the social infrastructures and what it needed to get programs financed from the philanthropic stakeholders, from the academic stakeholders. Occupational therapy has always had to partner almost in allyship with men of stature and privilege that could understand the value of occupation, that can see the occupation, and that can champion our cause. Because we're talking about 100 years ago. This was when the suffragettes and first and second wave feminism had to escalate to the point of violence and irreparable self-harm just to get the right to vote, let alone the right to develop the theoretical grounding. Even today, it's obviously a stirring controversy that people of color could have insight into the theoretical positioning of these questions. That is being able to be a scientist, to be a theorist, is not a power that's ever been trusted in Western civilization to be held outside of a very exclusive group of people. Yeah. And in order to survive, unfortunately, in the current structures that we're a part of, occupational therapy, to stay alive through this, has had to partner in allyship with men that can champion our cause. And what we're creating right now is an opportunity to maybe have different choices, to see if we can recalibrate and make that look differently, to have some autonomy, to have some agency, not just as women, but as frontline providers and for occupational beings, and maybe question what it looks like for our clients to be the leading role in determining how our theory develops and how our practices. That's really where occupational science is steering us to look like, in part because it has invested in becoming inclusive for the past 30 years.
Yeah. And again, the exposure in the early 90s to how qualitative methodologies could enrich our understanding of the role of occupation in a person's life. And it took about 10 years for the idea of mixed methods research to really filter into OT and occupational science in a way that was approved and sanctioned.
Formally embraced.
And formally embraced. But those new ways of knowing really expanding the potential for us to build a stronger and stronger theoretical base. But the point that I was making is that Kielhofner was just beginning to work on his model of human occupation in the mid-70s. And I think his first publication was 1978, if that early, or his first text on it. But at any rate, there wasn't a theoretical base, or there was, but it was built on psychiatry and medicine and biology and psychology. It came from other fields, in other words. So it took us those 20 years to begin building a stronger and stronger foundation. And I know my colleague Steve Park introduced me to the Canadian model of occupational performance, and my first exposure to the person-environment-occupation interaction and how that has grounded so many theoretical models that we have. And I began to see the power of that and being excited about being able to share that with students and give them more thinking tools, and how occupational science provided both specific tools for thinking and a foundation underneath both some past models and upcoming models for an even stronger understanding of how people function as occupational beings. And
I think that notion of a basic science too, which if you're not privy to those conversations, like so much of us that go through our K through 12 education, maybe associate's education and bachelor's education, So much of the structure of those educational environments is you get synthesized a summary of what those that are on, the scientists that are in those Ivy Towers, the conversations they get privy to, where science is maybe a bit messier, and you learn about the methodologies, and you learn about epistemology, and you learn about what it means when science is more in its raw form and its active state. Those aren't usually conversations that you get access to as an associate through bachelor's level student in higher education. Because it's dangerous, they don't really want everybody just experimenting with chemicals all over the place. It's rare to get exposed to even what it means that something's a basic science or something is an applied science. And I'm thinking too, to put in the context, if you're talking about the late 70s and early 80s, the internet was barely a thing that existed, and to the extent that it existed, it wouldn't have been accessible either to most people. So to think about, if you had, say, Kilhoffner developing this work, just how is that work going to go from, I think he was at USC, how is that going to go to the masses? How are you going to get that out to the therapists? It's like even the dynamic OT educators probably at that time that were teaching at the bachelor's and certificated level, they probably also were at a systemic advantage of even being able to translate the language of what Kilhoffner was putting out there. I think that just speaks to the need to democratize and make some of this terminology more accessible so that we can actually take advantage of all the work that we have done.
Yeah. And just a point of clarification, Kilhoffner was a master's student at USC, and Mary Riley was a powerful inspiration for him to begin learning about occupation, and she called it occupational behavior, and it evolved into his model of human occupation, along with Janice Burke in their writings. But he got his Ph.D. from UCLA, actually.
Oh, okay.
And did some very interesting work around disabilities that could be considered some early disability studies work in occupational therapy, because he was very interested in people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and how they functioned more independently in society and what adaptive skills and tools they use.
His relationship was to the medical model, because in a way I almost wonder how similar his and your arc maybe could be in some ways, because I need to learn more about Kilhoffner, but it does seem like he also took on increasingly more of the lens of rights, disability rights and advocacy, and shifting from more of a pure theoretical and philosophically robust logic kind of orientation. So then also considering what does it mean to adapt our theory and our understandings of occupational beings in a way that is meaningful to them, that connects and is genuinely client-centered. I think he's also a great model of having some institutional privilege and then also wielding that in a way that could create openings to extend that privilege out and giving a voice to others in the process. And I wonder too if we can use that to segue into how your work evolved after you got to pick up on these founding threads and be one of the first cohorts to go through this occupational science education as a clinician. How did that evolve? Like you as an occupational being, but also your interest as an occupational therapist, as an OT educator. How did that end up shaping your practice from this we established that you were really great at the medical model, and then you did a very big turn in your focus?
Yeah. Once I understood through the graduate educational process what occupation was and what potential it had for transformative experience, and particularly for transformative practice, both for the practitioner and for the clients of that practitioner, I just got more and more excited and realized that if I could impart some of that to students who are going to be future occupational therapists, then hopefully they would carry that passion and love for what it could provide into their practice and help them make an even more influential impact on the lives of their clients. And I'm confident I've had at least modest success in doing that based on the students that I talked to who graduated 20 and 10 and 5 years ago that I got to work with. And I got to work in a curriculum and be an administrator in a curriculum that could play with those ideas and shape them to hopefully do a better and better job of being a transformative educational experience.
Do you feel like you got to inherit that role in some ways of being the arbiter, of allowing that formal permission to explore some of those things? Because I think that's often part of the product of the systems that we're coming up in that are very hierarchical, and that we are inhabiting systems that privileges some perspectives over others, and how we can look at wielding that responsibly. What I was affirmed to know is that you noted that there was something about at USC having the status and those elders and those facilitators that gave you formal permission to play as a student, as a master's student, as a teacher's. Yeah.
A great example was in a doctoral class with Florence Clark. Our goal was to draw and analyze theoretical perspectives into a type of term paper, a research paper for the term, our kind of capstone project for that course. And I had read this fascinating biography of Miles Davis and was a bit of a jazz fan. And I kept seeing all these theories that we were studying integrated through his life. And it was like, that's kind of a risky topic to bring up. And I asked her about, I'm thinking about doing this. And she said, I hear your passion for it. It sounds like you've been stimulated to think about how the course material integrates through his life story. And I'd say go for it. And it was that kind of permission, because it was a pretty different way to pull the paper together. And it was one of my first publications in occupational science, because it got published in the first book on occupational science that Dr. Clark and Dr. Zemke wrote or edited.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful.
And it just was it brought theory to life for me in a very dramatic way.
You got to kind of follow where you mentioned that this was somewhat of a disorienting dilemma in a way. It was totally causing you to reflect on all your foundational assumptions about how the world works. And you found one thread that gave you that kind of role model or something to look off of, chase down and play and explore. And that's really speaking of theories, that's one of the theories of the design of this course, is trying to create some space somewhere in our life where we can play with these concepts. Yeah. And it really can help. I think sometimes we need what feels like formal permission. And then I think we almost, as just occupational beings in ourselves, have to get to a place of giving ourselves permission to explore these things, to develop our own identity, to develop our agency. I'm going to link to a lecture from Ruth Zemke that talks a little bit about the history of occupational science in this module. Mm-hmm. She talks and reflects about part of her interest in this founding cohort at USC was that they found that occupational therapy was starting to re-grasp its occupational core. However, in order to do it was appealing to the research and the theory that was being developed in psychology. And in your context, it was around the fields of anthropology. Occupational therapy was at this disadvantage to that, because I think in part too is that a lot of us really love being clinicians. It can be a big transition to, I know that's held me off. I haven't wanted to pursue a Ph.D. because I just wouldn't get to develop as a therapist. I really want to get more time in the field. And what's amazing about, I think, the gift of occupational science that we have now, because we do have doctorally trained theoreticians, and we're making this language more accessible. We don't have to appeal to these other disciplines to give us permission anymore, where they're the gatekeepers of their own theory and their own belief system. Right. Now we have OT ancestors and elders. We have folks like John and Ruth Zemke and Galia Frank, and expand that out to Ann Wilcock and how occupational science is developing globally. We now, as inheritors of the OT legacy, we have several layers of formal permission to engage in our own science and our own theory, and to create space to play with these, as we're the applied side of this field. And they've acknowledged that from the beginning of even the USC crowd, that occupational therapists or the applied side of the field, which makes it even more important that we have an active relationship to our basic science, to our narrative science. You deserve to be a part of this, and it's part of the spirit of this course, is to let you know, as a frontline clinician and a student, you now officially have formal permission to engage with these concepts. What do you think about, John? Do you think we're going into an era where it's maybe time to give kind of clinicians of all different walks of life and maybe even prospective folks insight into what occupational science is and maybe what it could be? It's almost this great opportunity. We say it's in the early stages still, but that's almost the best time to get involved, right?
Yeah, I hope so. I really hope so, because I do think it has great potential. And I'll segue from my last comments to hopefully answer this with another example. But an example was of the issue of permission and encouragement. A student who graduated from our program when I was first teaching found OT practice not very fulfilling. And we had numerous conversations about how that was affecting her and how it was affecting her clients. And she would talk about, oh, but I go in and volunteer at the same nursing home and I play music and I do people's hair and I love it. And I was like, these are things that you can integrate into your practice. And these are things that will allow that passion for your occupational interest to transfer and motivate your clients. And you can help them learn how to take care of their hair and their beauty needs. And you can help them learn how to share music in even simplistic ways. And she never believed that
it was real. That permission was real.
And largely because of the cloying influence of the setting and the fact that she didn't feel like she had permission in her practice setting to do those things. And so her having a course like this, had she had this kind of course when she was struggling with that,
because I know, yeah,
developed the language and the understanding and the evidence base and the Medicare permission to practice in those ways, I think she'd still be an occupational therapist. Instead, she went back to beauty work. And so that transitions into an example of how I've seen practitioners who've gotten exposure to occupational science through their interest in occupational justice work that they first call social justice work in criminal justice settings. And the justice-based occupational therapy interest group has embraced increasingly a larger and larger number of practitioners who are doing work in criminal justice to help give them that language and to support them with evidence and to share practice resources across these settings where people are working in jails, prisons, and other correctional settings, and using occupational in powerful ways to help transform the lives of the people who are incarcerated or transitioning into parole and trying to live in a civilian world that is not friendly to people with a record. And that's been very
occupational process where that I think comes from when you understand humans as occupational beings, and when you understand the systems that we're living in as transactional. It doesn't even matter if you have the formal words to describe it. It's going to take place that you can have a mutually transformative experience as an occupational being interacting with these systems, and that we are, even if you classify it as occupational or not, part of this basic science is it elucidates what's taking place when you understand that there's interrelationship between the material world and the structures we inhabit and the subjective and qualitative elements that are in place. There's structure and there's agency, and they're in a mutual dialectic that reinforces each other. And that's just part of the scientific process. And we're increasingly getting better methodologies that are actually elucidating that this is likely taking place. Problem with the qualitative things is they don't like being studied. They don't like being pegged down. They're live and they're in the moment. So if you can't capture it in the moment accurately, it's gone. So we're never going to get that certainty that we lust after in a very reductive, what you call reductionistic, structural centered scientist. It really loves certainty. It loves knowing the hard edges of things. The problem is the natural world doesn't love hard edges of things, and it doesn't like to stay put and be exactly where it was when we left it.
Yeah. But I think there's promising work that's happening out there. Again, Csikszentmihalyi was one of my first and most powerful examples in his work as a psychologist in flow, in developing the concept of flow, and how relevant that is for us as occupational therapists and occupational scientists, because that's what we're helping and seeking our clients to move into, is to be fulfilled and to have peak experiences through the things that they do with their time. And he took a very subjective experience and quantified it adequately to reach the heights of knowledge and influence in the world of psychology, which is a very demanding quantitative world still, although qualitative is leaking into it from the sides. And so, again, I think those are opportunities that we have.
Taking on, so I guess at this point that you're watching this lecture, you will have seen my occupational profile and my own disorienting dilemma coming from more of a hard science background initially, as hard as biology can get. But I come from a tradition, an intellectual tradition, and this is one of the things I wanted to actually discuss with you a little bit, John, too, when you come from a tradition, the tradition I came from was wanting actually to barricade off qualitative data just because it was too hard. Yeah. It was just too hard to imagine what methodologies were needed to take that into account, and the way that biologists were under funding constraints and navigating these structures is that they needed to make the samples as efficient and easy to publish as possible and as low stakes. And so we wouldn't take on qualitative questions, not because they weren't scientifically robust enough. It's just because we didn't have the measures to do it, and we didn't have a way to cheaply do it. And so there's almost a sense in some of the more hard science backgrounds, and I feel like I can speak to that as somebody with a bachelor's degree in field biology and evolutionary theory. It's almost it's been rebranded of, okay, we can sidestep the qualitative because it's not good enough for us. It's not hard enough for us. It's not hard science enough. But I'll tell you as an insider is that we've also just sidestepped it because it was too hard. And just because it's too hard, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a causal impact on the universe. Really, one of the things that evolutionary theory taught me is that things that sustain over evolutionary time, it's hard to sustain over evolutionary time. It has some sort of functional purpose if it's there. And as qualitative, especially as humans are, and how richly we value our subjective and qualitative experience, if that didn't have some sort of causal impact on how humans are able to adapt to our environments and function within them, it would be gone, because energy is not easy to come by in the natural world. You don't expend it on things, and brains and symbolic and culture. It's very expensive to do that. I think that's what I love about occupational science is it's very daring to be open to take on the challenge of what it means to understand the qualitative domain scientifically, and in relation to not just past primates or ancestral humans, but present day humans. What does it mean in the current context? And for folks that are maybe living a non-standard life, they don't have the same body, they're experiencing illness, injury, disability, that adds a whole other layer of complexity on top of it.
Right.
So I think really I want to congratulate everybody in occupational science for taking on some of the hardest questions. And I think that we should really feel proud of that as inheritors, as the clinicians that get to be on the applied side of this field. Is not only are we not scientific, but we are taking on some of the hardest science to do. And we're willing to let that be an open question and to admit that we may not have the methodologies down yet. We're still developing them. And we're also open to doing that collaboratively when most disciplines are usually barricading off and wanting to keep everything prioritized. Occupational science is also saying, you know what, these are big enough questions that I think we need more than just us. Can you join us? And clients, can you be there? I just want to
And
Yay,
I think,
it's so good.
yeah, and I think practitioners can help provide an anchor point for occupational science to move in ways that do function to serve practice more directly. That's where a lot of it has come from. For example, Dr. Florence Clark and the USC team conducted the USC Well Elder Study, first published in 1996, lead issue on gerontology in the Journal of American Medical Association. Again, a breakthrough piece of research that has been replicated many times and shown how not only the role of occupation and occupational scientific knowledge grounds a powerful occupational therapy practice program with people living well to keep them well, but that it persists over time, much better than the comparative methods, treatment methods. And it integrated qualitative and quantitative methodology. Once again, one of the things that enriched the numbers that they collected were the stories of the people whose lives were dramatically changed and enhanced. A grandmother who got the courage through the OT support to ride the bus again so she could visit her grandchildren, and people taking art courses, artists who had given up on art, who got the courage to go out and take art courses because they understood how it could influence their own health. Powerful research that I hope every occupational therapist will know and use to support their work.
Which I wonder too, John, because you had such a robust foundation in the medical model by the time that you went into USC too, I'm hoping that you'll say yes to this question. By embracing the occupational science lens, do you think that you've had to compromise that medical model even one bit? Or is that something that you've gotten to take with the good parts of that with you?
No,
you just add something on top of it.
Yeah. I don't. I think some people might say that there was some compromise, but my interpretation in retrospect now of 30 years of teaching and some practice along the way integrated with that is that I mostly taught the physical rehabilitation components in the curricula. And I think what I was able to do, not as well as I wish I had in retrospect, but I think fairly well, is keep occupation's role in helping people improve their physical health and rehabilitative recovery at the forefront as an important and useful tool for that kind of rehabilitative and medical-based practice. Because knowing that the majority of those jobs that they were going to get were going to be in those settings.
I think that the medical model, even by the principle, the historical context that it grew out of, it can be one of the places where that can still be some of the more occupationally deprived and can really utilize that lens of, it can be a place where a lot of occupational deprivation is experienced. That's clear to see in a lot of incarceration populations and refugee populations. And at the same time, I remember hearing, I'll probably talk about this a little bit when we talk about Jane Goodall, who had a legacy with USC.
Yeah.
I forget, University of Southern California. Yeah. I remember hearing her speak about finding out about chimpanzees that were being studied in university settings without any connection to materials and engagement. And she pivoted from doing field biology to championing the quality of life of chimpanzees that were living in contained and institutionalized formal experimental settings, and really shifting to focus on their quality of life, and knowing that she got to develop an appreciation for the rich complexity of the lived experience of chimpanzees. And when I heard her speak about that, it gave me some grief. That it's almost easier to see and champion and see how that would be necessary for chimpanzees that have been torn out of their natural environment and deprived of any connection to each other and things that are meaningful. But I'll be honest, I feel like I see that every day that I go into the hospital and that I'm working in the skilled nursing facilities or some of the school-based practice settings. it's interesting that it's still hard to adopt that same lens and level of a need for immediate action to bring occupation into our medical settings, into our educational settings, where not to demean or devalue the occupational needs of other non-human creatures, but these are also human beings that deserve this perspective. And I guess what I will say, at least from my own experience as coming into the conversations about occupational science with some formal like biology training, I don't feel like I've necessarily been pushed to a point that I have to abandon my previous biology frame of reference or all that I've invested in being a medical therapist, that it's actually, once you really learn to engage with it, they can be symbiotic and compatible perspectives. You can actually build off of all the knowledge you invested so far. It's adding that lens and almost that frosting of occupation on top of it. So I don't think we have to look at occupational science as something that's mutually exclusive with the other traditions of thought that we've already built. I'm curious what you think about that, John.
As we're getting the opportunity to learn again, as humans often have to be exposed many times to lessons and to learn them, of the power of the strength of diversity in improving communities, in improving systems, improving theory and ideas. The more diverse input there is, the stronger the outcome in almost all cases. And that's been my experience with occupational science and occupational therapy, that the more we work together and the more we integrate our shared knowledge and respect that knowledge for where it's coming from, so that I would never condemn a highly medical model practitioner or someone who's focusing almost exclusively on sensory processing in their pediatric practice or adult practice, because they know a lot about that can help me understand how that occupation responds to that intervention. And hopefully they will pick up some interest and passion from me about the role of occupation in enhancing that interaction or celebrating how they use that. The sensory processing therapist with play. Wow, what a powerful way to use occupation.
Even if you're following, so I think that's one way of saying this. It's like there's still some really valid insight that experimental reductionistic scientific inquiry can offer us, and bringing that back to how we understand humans as occupational beings in a basic science. So say the things that have continued on in the tradition of Ayer's work, sensory integration, they've been also exploring what it means to understand sensory systems and to test those hypotheses with more traditional experimental methods rather than just qualitative methods. The insight that we get from the outcomes of that research, it still comes back to the context of humans and occupational beings, and we get to reconcile with what the data and exploration that they get in that context. What does that mean when we put humans into context? And it's something that I'm sure everybody here, as you explore, and what I love about occupational science is we as clinicians, we get to validate the measurable, more physical, more mechanistic outcomes that our clients value and what they want to make progress on. At the same time, we also get to use qualitative measures and qualitative assessment tools to ask, what does this mean to you in context? Why do you want increased range of motion in your arm? Or what would it mean that you're a low registration sensory system? What sort of environments and contextual factors and what is meaningful to you? Maybe you're sensory sensitive, but you also want to explore jazz. How do we support you in context in being in a rich sensory environment? It's something that can, in my mind, it can be symbiotic and it can be compatible to embrace an occupational science perspective with some of these more traditional frames of reference. They ultimately are going to circle back to being connected to occupational beings and their quality of life, because whether you like it or not, if you're a treating and field occupational therapist, you're working with humans in the field. We're not really working with humans in experimental conditions. Right. So you get to contextualize this work in context, and now you have the language to classify it as its own distinct science base. You mentioned, John, that you have a partner that's a physical therapist, and we probably all know that sometimes there's a tension and interesting things. I highly encourage that as, I guess, a disorienting dilemma process, because my partner is an applied behavioral analyst, a board-certified behavioral analyst, and I was really anti-ABA. I was very concerned about behavioral analysis from that tradition of thought. But being in partnership with him, I've had to learn what does behavioral therapy, where did that come from, and what does it have with occupational perspective? And I found even there, this is part of where I think we can be interdisciplinary, is that occupational theme frame of reference, where it validates multidisciplinary thought. We can see where the opportunities to infuse occupation within it. And if we're saying that one scientific perspective, like maybe PTs are too biomechanical, or maybe behaviorists, they're too observational, they're not taking into account the subjective. That's then an opportunity to see how can we then use occupation as a glue to find ways where we're working towards compatible goals that support the well-being of our clients. I feel like occupational science, not only is it not incompatible with other traditional modes of occupational therapy, I think they're also compatible with being able to build collaborative relationships with other disciplines and other clinicians. What do you think about, like, how have you been historically situated with OS? What does it mean that we're so collaborative or transdisciplinary or multiple disciplinary? What would you want clinicians to know about that?
I guess, first of all, is the value of learning from our fellow disciplinarians. The different practices have much to teach us. And the more we can also learn from them, I think the more we can get inside their worldview. And the more we can get inside their worldview, then the more we can understand their own occupational needs and desires. And if you bring it back down to, again, the Canadian model of occupational performance, what are their occupational performance goals as a professional? And if I can understand that, then if I need to work with them on a team to implement a new program that I think is going to be helpful for the clients across the board, then I can appeal to that interest in their goals and their occupational needs. And probably I've also gotten to know them personally and gotten to know that they love to bicycle, or they love to quilt, or they love to watch a particular Netflix show, and can have conversations that, again, build personal alliances at the same time that we're trying to build a professional alliance.
Definitely. And that all translates from practice and also scientifically, because then you can also build partnerships with other departments and other theorists and therapists to create a more rich understanding of what it means to understand humans in a contemporary context.
Yeah.
And I'll be mindful of both of your time and everything, because I just love this concept and I want to continue this conversation on. I'm hoping that students that are taking this can notice and see in some of the stories that John's told here that occupational scientists are clinicians just like us, and also got exposed to theory and occupational science really late, or maybe in the middle points of their career, and are also likely going through disorienting dilemmas themselves because the field continues to evolve, and those core assumptions are continually challenged and recalibrated. That's one of the things that I wanted to bring up before we'll transition at some point too, is what it means to be part of a legacy. And I know you mentioned earlier that Gary Kilhoffner, it's sometimes looked at as like a not good thing that he built off of some of the foundations that Mary Riley put before him. And I will be honest that it seems like most of what I can trace down, that this is part of the structures of academia, or just part of being occupational beings in of itself, is we tend to build off of the foundation that was laid before us.
Yeah.
And I wonder too, as we build off a foundation that was laid in our past, there's also this opportunity to look at it differently and to maybe recalibrate or extend or expand. That we get this gift sometimes of inheriting something that's often imperfect. And it's like a great thing that it's imperfect, because that means we get an opportunity to explore and shift it and adapt it to the current context we're in. I'm curious, in one of the things I regret we didn't get to touch on too much is just how much you pivoted from the medical model to taking a sense of the rights and more of the occupational justice aim, and that you went from a context where the mental health system was getting divested from and repositioned in more of the incarceration and police context. And little did you know, you went from a very apolitical person to that now actually being the core of your academic work. And you evolved as an occupational being, as somebody that was more apolitical, to adopting a broader lens. And I don't know, maybe you can't even avoid seeing your work outside of a political context, and even your scientific work outside of a political context.
It is hard to separate now what I could do as an educator, as an administrator, as a practitioner. It was difficult to separate it from the political and the political economy, because anything that we wanted to do in our academic program had to be at least budget neutral. And that's had a huge influence. And again, learning about occupational science from the very many inputs included some socio-political analysis and learning that, again, helped me understand that. But I think the bottom line is that the context is huge. The context is what shapes so much of what happens. And
occupational beings within that context, what I'm hearing from what you just said is that even as you adopted roles in more formal positions, you couldn't turn that occupational science part of your brain off. It became a lens that actually helped you mediate challenges where it wasn't explicitly a therapeutic context. It's more of an educational context, or viewing maybe the whole university system as an occupational, I forget the term of that, but it's just like a whole occupational enterprise where all the occupational beings, it's almost like bees in a hive. And that's one of the spirit of this course, is that jumping off point, that even if you're finding, like with this disorienting dilemmas, I can't make time to journal or to meditate or considering these things. Over time, if you engage with these concepts, it's going to be something that you start to process within the systems that you're inhabiting already. You'll start by seeing yourself as an occupational being, and then you'll start seeing all these other things play out, and noting that this perspective is compatible with everything that exists as part of relativism, and having a yes and approach to information it's not, you don't have to reject or just go into a tight little box about information. You can explore how this evolves. So unfortunately, whether you like it or not, you might not be able to walk away from occupational science after this, because it's not, and you might not be able to not see the politics. That was probably a very short focused part of your life that you got to be apolitical, and then now it's out of the bag. And do you find that I
think most occupational therapy students, and particularly those that have a curriculum that's more strongly occupation-based, by the end of the first semester, they're beginning to go, it's hard for me not to see life in a non-occupational way. And that tends to strengthen as they go through the educational process and learn more theory and more how to analyze the context and that person, environment, occupation interaction. And I've thrilled at it, because I've always been interested in people's stories and how they talk about what they like to do and what motivates them and what they have passion for. And as I learn more about occupational science and the role of occupation, again, that fortunately is being integrated slowly and more steadily into OT education, it just was a powerful way to understand human behavior and human interest and connect with people, and it enhanced practice. I'm going to jump slightly to another point that you brought up about my evolution from, what I would say it was a more limited medical, more physically focused, with acknowledgement of the psychosocial component, with acknowledgement of the environment, but not a deep honoring of those components, to shape the context for the clients that I was working with in physical rehab, and how that changed to embrace more fully this full interaction of the person, environment, occupation context, and how that influenced my thinking about the solutions that we would seek together to provide them, hopefully, with a richer life. And as I learned about occupational justice, when Dr. Liz Townsend and Dr. Ann Wilcock developed that notion in the late 90s, it hit me like a brick in a way. It was like, whoa, this is a really practical way to put some of these occupational science ideas into practice. And fortunately had students who were working in a local correctional facility that got us more and more involved over time, to where we actually were able to hire some therapists to work in that facility for a couple of days a week. And one of the delights of my career, now that I've been retired a couple of years from academia, but the last few years of my teaching work involved being able to work 1 to 2 days a week in that correctional facility as the OT practitioner, and to see the role that occupation played in helping wake up people who had struggled with mental health, with addiction, with criminal activity, and the incarceration dilemma that they had experienced, to wake up to the fact that they might have a life outside of the life that they had lived before. Tools to break out of a negative cycle of incarceration and parole and reincarceration, and the joy of supervising students who had learned their lessons about occupation-based practice so effectively that they were teaching me about how to integrate occupation more effectively into our life skills classes. And sometimes I felt like the student. It was a fantastic way. And unfortunately, the facility had to close all programming due to COVID, and it's just now beginning to reintroduce it. So I'm hoping that I might get a chance to do a little bit of fill-in work and student teaching there again. So we'll see how that works out.
I just feel from what you're saying, what you just brought up is I have this like sense of like even Adolf Meyer just cheering that this was something that we've gone through in some ways, I think, a grief process as a field where we've had these initial aspirations and wanting to cultivate contexts that support the well-being of people that society wants to put away into institutional context. And I think that even our founders, even if they were in a cultural context that made it really hard to extend that perspective beyond a narrow class of maybe usually European immigrants. And right now we have the opportunity to dream bigger about what it means to yearn for a better life for those that are institutionally housed, those that are put through cycles of incarceration, and understanding the co-occupational transformational learning experience, that it's helping us as a field as well be in symbiosis with our values and our virtues, and to not just have this be lip service that we pay to having those initial wishes and dreams to support those that are institutionalized, to really make good on that promise to have community-based programming and to have alternatives to incarceration and mental health sanitariums. And that even though we didn't make good on that in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, we may just be entering a timeline where choosing to be in integrity with those virtues and in partnership with the communities that are impacted by particularly incarceration, being in solidarity with those communities, listening to them and responding as members that have privilege in these social systems, we have the invitation today to be a part of making those systems better. And if you are open to that perspective, have you found that, especially after engaging with occupational science, maybe an antidote to cynicism? Do you have some hope and optimism for the potential to can continue where OT founders left off and in developing solutions to some of the imperfections in the current systems that are in power in the United States and across the globe? How do you feel about the potential for occupational therapy practitioners to be part of a rich and optimistic lineage for occupational beings?
One of the gifts of my learning over the years is how occupational therapy in our practice framework defines the client as an individual or an organization or a population. And this was reinforced by the work that Townsend and Wilcock did with occupational justice, because they start with the population and how the population is deprived through systemic or political or economic constraints or policies, deprived of whole occupational categories of engagement. And when you see that, again, it awakens your hopefully your political advocacy and your political activism to say, we need to fight against that so those people can have those opportunities. People should be able to get into nature. People should be able to get an education. People should have access to work. People should not be deprived because of an arbitrary issue like skin color or religion or sexual orientation. I have to do something about that. And what can I do as an occupational therapist informed by this understanding? And I think that was where some of my joy came from in working in the correctional system, was that I was working at a very micro level with a small population of people who I felt like we were reclaiming some of our lost potential for. And in the justice-based occupational therapy group, we have a very audacious dream, which is to transform the criminal justice system into a humanitarian rehabilitation and growth opportunity for the people who are introduced into it.
It turns out that it was actually quite expensive to take a more punitive approach, an occupational deprivation approach, right? There was a sense that, maybe it will be cheaper if we close down the mental health things. Instead of improving on that model, we took one and it ended up being actually quite expensive to do it that way.
Yes.
And maybe even just expensive too in noting that spiritual domain, that there's a cost in being out of alignment with many like core humanitarian values, which is something that at least occupational therapy claims in the United States and that many of us hold as just helping professions in general. I just have found that I was losing some of my hope for occupational therapy before I went back to school. That's part of why I went back there, is because I was feeling bleak about where was I actually going to get to do ever any occupation-based practices. It's just running into barriers everywhere. And it was really getting a chance to engage that lens of occupational science. And I love that it's been termed that science of hope, and trying to point out where we have agency and where our structures are actually mutable. I think that when you get to one of the critiques of, say, a biological approach or more of the physical reductionistic approach, if you're only looking at structures, all you'll see is structures and everything just looks fixed and set in place. Can't do anything about anything. And that's what's really helpful to have a science of agency as well, is because you can see where can structures shift. It's ironic because I was studying evolutionary theory. Evolution is all about change, but the lens of inquiry can actually be quite rigid and you don't see any grounds for change. But here you get to see the small potentials, and even like you're saying on a very small scale, that you get to go into a set of incarceration and make a practical, transformative, facilitate a mutually transformative experience that humanized members of your community, just like Jane Goodall going in and providing meaningful alternatives for the chimpanzees that were being deprived of their environment, of their comforts. What an amazing gift.
And her recognition that occupational science had an opportunity to contribute to that understanding, and her sponsorship through the Goodall Foundation Fellowship for Wendy Wood to study occupation in captive chimps, in zoo captive chimps.
He made a correlation in that scientific study to also look at the occupational deprivation. I don't know if she used those wordings, but she said chimps in captivity, which is like something that clearly is scientific, but also use that insight to also look at what are the environments we're setting up for older adults and
Yes.
older adults
Yes.
that are experiencing dementia and progressive neurological decline. That was one of those things that did actually give me hope. I got connected to one of her articles while I was studying dementia in that program during COVID. I was working in memory care, which is similar to, I hope everybody's enjoying the length of this conversation. I know I certainly am, but.
Well, it may have to be delivered in 2 packages.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. So you were mentioning earlier that there was a pendulum swing between private financing and public financing and how those structures can mediate what's possible for occupational therapy. And I know right now we're going through a critical juncture in the United States where there's almost a little bit more, I guess in my state, a shift towards privately mediated context. Like I'm finding we're discharging people from hospitals a lot quicker. We are looking at more community-based solutions to pretty complex medical conditions. And what I was noting in the more corporately owned private memory care facility that I was providing, technically, what's it called? Mobile outpatient therapy services through Medicare which has like a hybrid private copay situation. And you're able to provide different services with Medicare once you kind of delineate what's covered and not covered. But there's a lot of folks that maybe traditionally would have been institutionalized or living in a long-term care home that are now living in assisted living facilities that haven't been quite adapted for that environment. So anyway, me working on the ground floor, first time working with memory care, I got acquainted with one of Wendy Wood's articles about the notion of humans in captivity and activity deprivation of chimps in primatology. And here I am in the middle of COVID where we're taking folks with progressive neurological conditions and gross motor deterioration and putting them behind their rooms without any social visual cues, any activities present. And that article gave me the confidence, because probably some others have had this experience. In the last couple of years, physical therapy has been taking on a stronger role in treating ADLs. So I was getting in a position where physical therapy and the physical therapy assistants are working on toileting transfers, shower transfers, adaptive equipment, and even dressing. I was like, what the heck am I even going to work on? I'm trapped in this building. I can't go anywhere during COVID. I'm going to actually read literally to the law what Medicare says our role is. I'm going to read literally what the AOT guidelines are for Alzheimer's and dementia. I'm going to take this article from Wendy Wood and I'm going to build activity programs, and I'm going to I'm going to use like a school-based model of saying, can this person access and participate with the activities group? Because a lot of the more advanced dementia folks were being excluded from the activities program because the activities director didn't know how to include them in the activities. So I would show her and break down through activity analysis how we could adapt some of the activities so that they could at least be present and that they can engage. And that I didn't feel weird about that, because as previously in school-based therapists, that was my role. Right. I was there to facilitate and grade fine motor, and I could bring up where the Medicare guidelines. It put me in tension, right, with management, and it was really confusing with my corporate therapy provider. But you know how you said that they pulled out of arts and crafts because they thought families showed up, they would feel like it was demeaning somehow. I was just waiting for the families to be able to come in and see what I was facilitating from the older adults. Like I had somebody who was a mechanic, and he built like a really promising mechanic shop. He was such a badge of pride in his occupation that he did that. We could not get him to take a shower to save his life. So one of the things that was interesting was working on bathing goals, because a lot of folks with dementia, you can imagine how traumatizing that is to be pushed into a shower room and have all sorts of different people touch you in different ways. And so I would train the staff in doing preparatory activities that were meaningful and calming, and sensory activities that were calming for the residents. So like we would have some time with the baby doll. We'd have some time watching puppies running in a field on YouTube, or going in and cleaning the shower first, let's clean the shower together and then casually disrobe and get the thing going. And what I would do is I would go from three people that were needed to facilitate a shower that was violent and aggressive to just one person being able to set that person for success up in the shower. But with the mechanic, what I would do is I would be like, hey, the contractor put in a shower for the guys. They're really upset because there's getting a lot of oil on the upholstery. We need them to shower up before they clean out these cars. Can you investigate the shower, make sure they did a good job? Can we check out these pipes here and get it set up on, we might as well do a test through it. So I could get him to shower where no one else could shower. And it was because I knew about occupational narrative, occupational history, how to build off of their successes and their strengths.
Yeah, that role of occupational identity is so powerful at a time when a person's losing themselves through the dementia progression. Yeah.
I was using Medicare guidelines. I was using occupational science literature. I was using the best practices from AOTA, and my goals centered ADL performance and IADL performance and access and participation. You have permission because they have built this foundation from us. You get to be part of this legacy. And it's really from the investment of clinicians like John. There's hundreds of them. It'd be interesting to know how many people that have been formally trained in occupational science throughout the globe. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm sure it's in the hundreds, but we have 30 years of a lineage that you get to inherit for the first time. It's something that your OT ancestors wanted for you. And it's a very constructive way to wield privilege in the current context, especially if you're open to learning about it. It's transformed my life in less than 2 years. And John, it sounds like it transformed your whole life path from where you thought you were going, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the transformation was well set in 1 year of coursework, but certainly the following years of involvement just continued to build on that transformation, and has just been very powerful and prompted me to engage with others to get the Society for Study of Occupation, SOUSA, established and hopefully successfully operating, and continued involvement with that, and conversations with AOTA about ways that we can bring occupational science more explicitly into the national conference each year, and just involvement in various ways to try to, again, advocate and be active in promotion of ways to get these ideas. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity to share those thoughts and those ideas. And I thank you for making this course available to occupational therapy practitioners, because I think it's starting the filling of a gap that has been, again, too easy to neglect. And I think this will be a great step in that direction. I also got reacquainted more through indigenous science, through the lens of occupational science, and some of the conversations that we're bringing up there. And when you connect to some of the more indigenous framings of developing as an occupational being, I do think we have a right to our lineage and our connection to our forebearers and our ancestors. And they're always imperfect. They're always imperfect legacies that we inherit. And I think that this is, in my mind, it's a birthright to occupational therapists to connect to our history, to connect to our legacies, to pick up those threads where they left off. Our OT ancestors didn't get the institutional and the systemic opportunities that we have today. It is objectively easier than it was 100 years ago to have access to these institutions that we come into. At some point, I'll link to a great conversation about OT Trojan horsing, where sometimes we get brought in on one premise, but we can bring in occupation in a different way. And I think over time, one of my hopes is that we can be more explicit about being occupation-based. Today, we have formal permission from our science base to AOTA, to formal clinical practice guidelines, to the occupational therapy practice framework. Just about everywhere you can go and every law you can look at, if you look in that lens, you'll find permission to be occupation-based. In some cases, you'll find requirements to do that, but I'm not here to be a punitive approach to this.
but we have an invitation that our ancestors didn't have. And so we're sharing this with you. And John's he's a really dynamic leader in US-based SSO. Like in this other interview in this module, we were talking to the executive director of the Social Justice Sewing Academy. You could probably feel in her voice how much she wanted to collaborate with occupational therapists as part of their mission and their goals. It's terrifying and it's scary, the potential that we have to be a transformative force in this country. John's made it really clear in this project, I have support to do this work. You have support to do this work. We have a science base that is backing us up. We have infrastructure that's backing it up. We need to find ways to support and build community to resource each other so we feel brave to make good on those initial attentions that Adolf Meyer and Eleanor Clark Schlegel and unnamed individuals that experience occupational deprivation and violence at the hands of the initial founding of this country. We get to be a constructive part of facilitating healing for occupational beings. Thank you for holding space for this conversation. And it's something that we mourn the challenge of having this conversation in formal OT education at this time, but we need to make space for this conversation to happen. One of the last things to probably lead off on, John, is you mentioned the Society for Occupational Science here in the US. What threads do you have insight to? What do you see being developed for clinicians to get involved in the conversation and in developing occupational science? Can you contextualize a little bit of sort of the aspirations and the wishes for SSO to create openings for clinicians?
Yeah, the society has always welcomed anyone with an interest in developing and promoting the science of occupation from wherever they come from. Practice, OT practice. We have psychologists, geographers, anthropologists, medical anthropologists, sociologists who've gotten interested in the science and have helped develop the knowledge base around that and published in our field and in their fields about it. And OT practitioners are always welcome if they have an interest in supporting the development of the science. Even if you don't feel confident contributing as a researcher yet, I will say that the conversations and the level of dialogue at our national conference and in our virtual meetings is highly interesting. And practitioners, some of them do move into a theoretical realm that I even can have a hard time keeping up with. But for the most part, they're very practical research papers that are looking at how do people occupy their time? How can this knowledge be used to improve society, whether that be through practice or information that psychologists can benefit from, or just interesting to us as human beings.
You mind if I pitch? We don't know exactly when it's going to be launching, but they're currently developing our own occupational science journal in the United States that has part of its mission and vision is looking at applied research that traditionally has been difficult to find venues to publish applied research in occupational science internationally. It's something that AOTA hasn't always wanted to sponsor. It's something the Journal of Occupational Science hasn't always had connected to it, but it's something that a lot of the US-based OS enthusiasts have been interested in, and they've gotten to a point of let's make space to celebrate this. So pretty soon,
And my guess is that that journal will probably see the first publication within 18 months. I would hope so. And currently, you can read about occupational science work in the Journal of Occupational Science and other OT journals like OT Journal of Research, British Journal, Canadian Journal of Occupational Therapy, occasional publications that are specifically oriented toward occupational science and or occupational justice as applied through occupational therapy situations or applied to help improve and inform occupational therapy practice. The Journal of Occupational Science does not publish those because they're more interested in the theoretical domain, but they're very encouraging of us to begin publication so that if you've done a program that you're inspired to develop and implement because of your understanding of occupation, and you feel like that program benefited from it and also can benefit others in learning about how you did that and how occupation enhanced the outcomes of that program, then that would be the kind of write-up that could be published in this SSO USA journal. We don't have a title for it yet.
A lot of clinicians, I think it's a great thing that so much of us want to be in the field. We want to be practicing. We want to be practical. Most of us aren't going to go out of our way to upend our lives and go pursue a 4 to 8 year long Ph.D. for this. But we do have hundreds of people around the world that have taken that leap, that have invested. And most of them that I've met are eager to publish, and they're eager to publish things where their ideas that they develop theoretically have the ability to see an applied setting and get feedback from the clients and from the clinicians that are engaging in the work. We are going to have a context very soon, within 18 months in the United States. It's probably something you guys would have dreamed of at USC, right, for decades. Yeah. And here we get this opportunity on the ground floor to partner with our allies in academia. Because really, even if they're in Ivy Towers, they're our allies. We have shared goals. We want to support occupational beings. We're getting more and more opportunities to take on these partnerships. So this course here is just a start. I hope you're seeing from this conversation how rich and generous occupational science has been to both John and I as legacy inheritors of clinicians in this field. We're so lucky to have this to support us. We have our own science base. It's just discovering, learning about it, and allowing it to create space for imagining new possibilities, both for us and our clients. I hope you are taking on this conversation and seeing hope for our field and openness for where you are positioned in occupational therapy history. I hope it fills you with some nervousness, some excitement, and some openness to consider some new potential. Right now, we're just playing. We're just exploring. There's no real pressure. But I think you would affirm too, John, that even if occupational science is a little scary at first, it ends up being a really delightful perspective to carry with you throughout your day.
Oh, it can be transformative. And that's what I would hope for those of you hearing this and exploring occupational science, maybe for the first time or maybe at a deeper level than you've been able to do it before. And that you help us realize what I believe is a very hopeful future for occupational therapy that is informed, enriched, and supportive of the growth that has the potential for occupational therapy to be. Because as Mary Riley said, there will always be a need for occupation-supported occupational therapy. Whether occupational therapists are the ones to do it or not remains to be the question and depends on us for optimizing those opportunities. And that's what I hope for our future.
Is there anything else that you feel like you didn't get a chance to say, or does that feel like a good concluding point?
It's been a delightful conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I thank you for the opportunity. And again, appreciate your work, Josie, to make this available to a wider audience. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you so much for your time, John.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll stop the recording here. Hello. I hope everyone enjoyed that interview. It certainly was a rich discussion for me. And I just wanted to remind you guys that this is a sample of the curriculum that is featured in the Foundations of Occupational Science for US-based Occupational Therapist course that's going to be launching later this month. If you want to be one of the first 40 OTPs to be introduced in the founding cohort of this course, please see the link below. I would love for you to get signed up to be one of the initial stakeholders to engage more deeply with this subject. Thank you so much for your time.